All right, thank you everyone for joining our seminar today. For your information, the seminar is being recorded and we will make it available on the RemPlex webpage. And as a reminder, we request that you please keep yourself muted during the presentation and the Q&A. And also we encourage you to rename your participant profile to your actual full name if you'd like. So if you hover your cursor over your name, over the 3 dots by your name, you can click rename and you can change your participant name to your full name so we can see who's joining us today. My name is Alicia Gorton with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, or PNNL, and I'll be moderating today's seminar on behalf of the Center for the Remediation of Complex Sites, or RemPlex. RemPlex is a PNNL platform that couples unique core competencies and expertise with state-of-the-art facilities and physical assets to develop, mature, and deploy advanced technologies to solve complex issues of contaminated subsurface environments. Today's seminar by Mike Truex of PNNL will discuss what we need to know to select and implement effective remedies. For example, how do we determine the type and extent of information that is needed to support remediation decisions? Also, what resources and approaches are available to facilitate obtaining the appropriate technical information? Mr. Truex will explore these questions using some case study examples. Mr. Mike Truex is an advisor at PNNL in environmental remediation and serves as the Deputy Director of Environmental Remediation Applications of RemPlex. His experience includes work at the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and private remediation sites. Major programs include support to the DOE Hanford site, providing technical and programmatic support for assessing and implementing improved remediation and characterization technologies. In addition to authoring numerous journal articles and technical reports, Mike has also co-authored multiple technical guidance documents. During and after the presentation, I encourage you to submit any questions you have via the chat box, which will be monitored and will be passed along to Mike for discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike to kick us off. Mike?
Great, thank you, Alicia. So as Alicia said, my title today is Understanding Environmental Site Conditions. What do we need to know to select and implement effective remedies? So right away, you might sense a little tension in that title, which for me centers around, of course, the words need to know. When you think about subsurface remediation, which is what I'll be talking about today, we do have a limited capacity to know things. We can't know everything. We don't have access to the subsurface in a way that allows us to know everything. But that's where we couple the words together, need to know, because that's really what we're trying to determine here. You know, what can we determine about the subsurface that will support enough knowledge base to then support a decision to help us either select or implement a remedy. So that's one little caveat about the title. And also the need to know is really defined by the decision makers. And so I think we need to recognize that there are multiple aspects that to go into managing and making decisions at a remediation site. I'm going to be speaking primarily about the technical aspects of that, the technical defensibility. What do we need to bring to the table as technical folks into that decision? But we do need to recognize that need to know is related to what the decision makers define. So that's part of it. And in terms of this technical focus, one of the things that we're giving this seminar as a part of the Center for Remediation of Complex Sites, or RemPlex. And so I'll be talking about this in the context of complex sites. And obviously this question is pertinent at any type of remediation site. You know, what do we have to understand about a site in order to determine what to do to mitigate some sort of contaminated issue? But at a complex site, we're going to really need to think about this carefully in terms of the level of detail that we're going to have to acquire as a part of having defensible support to remediation decisions. And so that's really the challenge we're going to address today, because at these complex sites where there are a number of challenges, we need to manage what we can know, because again, the complexities might make that difficult in terms of defining, and then how we map that into a good support of a decision. And what I'm going to propose today is that really an objectives and interpretation driven approach is an effective way to think about this, and really tying this to use of technical guidance documents and resources is really important. And so I'll try today to kind of talk through that, because of course deciding what you need to know is site specific, right? There are site specific elements about that. We have a given site, there's a situation, so that defines a certain amount of knowledge for that specific site. But it's really also a broader question, and that's where this idea of having a framework or a process in place that helps us address this question is a good thing to apply, because then when we think about our site-specific situation, we have, again, this sort of framework to use, and that can help facilitate remedy decisions. And again, that's particularly important at complex sites because there are potentially a lot of moving pieces. So that's sort of an overview of what I'd like to talk about today. And of course, in context, when we think about environmental remediation, I'm going to be talking about subsurface remediation. We have some basic things that we have to do. We have to describe the contaminant issue, know what we're dealing with, and that feeds into evaluating what sort of risks there are, about the exposure pathways, what sort of risks there are from the contamination, and therefore what sort of mitigation approach is going to be appropriate. And then when we move into implementation, we have to decide, well, what sort of remedy makes the most sense to implement? How do we then evaluate its performance? Maybe adapt it as needed, depending on the response of the subsurface to what we try for remediation. And then we have to find a stopping point. So at each of these steps in the process, there are going to be decisions that need to be made and some technical information that we have to bring forward to decision makers to help manage the remedy through this entire arc of the process. So that's kind of the context. So kind of keep that in mind. And then of course, when we think about that for complex sites, there are going to be challenges that are layered on top of that we're going to have to deal with. And this was well articulated in actually in numerous documents, but I'll highlight here in 2013, the National Research Council put out a really nice publication looking across the nation at groundwater contaminated sites and identifying that there are a portion of these sites where there are challenges, and there will be a need to kind of think carefully about how we proceed with remediation. In their document, proposing that we won't know everything at the start. We'll need to, maybe there's a remedy that's been implemented, but we may need to think about transition. So they talked about a transition assessment. So, well, how do we know what to do or understand the site well enough to manage that sort of transition assessment? Similarly, later in 2017, the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, ITRC, put out a document, Remediation Management of Complex Sites, and they also talked about, well, what are the aspects that make a site challenging? How do we layer that into what we can really accomplish with remediation? And then how do we then manage this process of ultimately achieving our site objectives? And they propose that, an adaptive approach might be appropriate because we'll have to learn as we go along. So both of these documents really point to the fact that at these complex sites, we're going to have a series of decisions that are going to have to be made to manage the process of remediation. So again, what do we need to know to bring to the table so decision makers can appropriately manage the remediation process? So some of those challenges, some of the things that we're going to have to think about in terms of technical information will be elements that might provide issues such as hydrologic processes. We may have groundwater surface water interfaces. We may have an interaction between beta zone and groundwater. There may be other factors in the hydrologic system that are challenges. Biogeochemistry aspects can be challenges. There you might think of commingled contaminants. So you can't only focus on one contaminant and do harm to the other. So we have to think about the whole system. We have to think about interactions with sediments. How does the contaminant interact, and how does that change either our ability to extract or treat it in place? What's the chemistry associated with the contaminants? And then also something that we really have to factor in is that we don't just have contaminants in a pristine groundwater system. Many times the waste solutions or what was disposed contain not only contaminants, but other factors that change the basic geochemistry of the subsurface. So these waste chemistries can also change the playing field for us. And so that's another challenge where we have to make sure we account for that in our approaches. And then the sort of the last category of challenges I'm highlighting here are these ideas that come forward when we have complex sites and we might need to go through different stages of remediation technologies. Well, how do we manage and know when we can stop active treatment and move on to passive approaches? How do we think about current remediation activities and then also transition to what we might need to do for long-term management? How do we effectively go through these steps? So these are things that we're going to have to think about. And again, all parts of that lead to us needing to define, well, what do we need to know to support those sorts of decisions? And of course, the reason we're giving this talk here for the RemPlex is because this center is really focused on this idea that through collaborative efforts, we need to, as a remediation community, decide, well, what sort of resources and information can we pull together to best allow us all to move forward to address these issues for our specific site. So that's sort of one of the charters for RemPlex, and so that's why we're going to talk about it here today. But if we're going to do remediation at a site, we have to do that within the context of how remediation is administered. So there's the rec run the circle process. So this is a familiar diagram to most people, I'm sure. The center circles on this diagram show the basic steps as you go from left to right and identifying the site and what the issues are, all the way through making a decision and implementing a remedial action. So that's the framework for administratively how we have to work through our site remediation. And the gray boxes around this are some elements that relate to things that facilitate conducting this process. And these are some of the elements that within RemPlex have been identified as important areas for emphasis. So when we think of quantitative conceptual site models that help us better articulate our site conditions, thinking about how we might need to use multiple remediation technologies in a synergistic way. So those are helpful at complex sites. How we might think about monitoring and how that might have to adapt over time, because again, our site may be changing or we may learn things over time with that. Adaptive management, again, we talked about that, something that we have to think about. How do we walk through those steps in a clear fashion? Looking at risk indicator monitoring. So what's really diagnostic for us? That may be important because, again, we can't know everything, but can we know some key elements that would help us? And then also this idea of national and international guidance. So that's another element that is included on here, because as I'll talk about today, that's important because that gives us sort of an articulation of, well, what do people expect you to know in order to help make decisions? So that's kind of what I'm going to move into talking about next. And that is sort of this proposed approach for complex sites, where really it's this combination of 4 key components that we have to think about. So on the left-hand side, we have the decision. So we need to know what decision we're supporting, and all through the entire remediation process, there are different decisions. We're never asleep at the wheel. There's always something we need to be thinking about as our next step. So there's going to be these decisions we have to support. And the guidance and objectives, that's really where we say, well, what's the framework? What do we need to know? How do we put information on the table that will help that decision process? So that's kind of formulating our best way to collect and synthesize technical information to support this decision. On the right-hand side, those next 2 boxes relate to interpretation. So how do we think about the data that we have for a site? And then the last box information is, well, what data do we have? And you'll note on this chart, the arrows go both ways between these boxes. So if you start on the left-hand side, we need to know what decision we're making, and that will help us decide, well, what sort of objectives and guidance do we need to consider? What sort of information do we need to put on the table in terms of interpretation and root site information? But then it also goes the other way. So as we collect information, as we get those fundamental information about the site contaminant, then it goes backwards. We have to go back because that eventually is what we put on the table for those decision makers. So it's really an interplay between all of these elements, and that's what I'd like to explore. So let's just dig down a little bit into each one of these. So if we think about decisions, so kind of categories of decisions are the need for mitigation, think about the end in mind first, right? Starting with the end in mind. So what's our end state going to be? Thinking about how we select remedies, and then once we select them, how we manage and optimize the remedy. So there you might think under that particular category, there's lots and lots of decisions that we have to support. And then finally, this decision for remediation closure. So guidance and objectives, that helps us define what we need to know. You know, again, with my caveats about need to know. And the example here I'll use is natural attenuation guidance. You know, there was a lot of discussion in the 90s about this fact that there were natural attenuation processes occurring. And when the EPA came out with their guidance on natural attenuation, they really did a great service because they defined the types of ways that you need to understand and articulate your site in terms of the processes that are happening, how that relates to the contamination present and its ability to continue to move, and whether or not that plume will expand, be stable, or contract, and then how that information as a whole can be used to support a decision for selecting monitor natural attenuation as a remedy. So that was a great example, and it was one that was sort of my introduction to how we can use those resources to help us formulate the questions and therefore guide our approaches in what we do at a specific site. There are a lot of other great examples, and I'll point to some of these as we go through the presentations, but EPA's put out some good guidance recently. Think about the groundwater roadmap, the ITRC with the complex sites document. There's adaptive site management guidance out there. There's a number of technical guidance about performance assessment. There's guidance out there and coming out about end states. And then of course the classic guidance that we have used for many, many years is how we set up data quality objectives. Well, there's a process for that, and that's a useful thing because it helps us articulate, again, how we formulate our efforts. In terms of interpretation, this is how we pull together and synthesize, you know, what is known about a site. And again, this is a place where we actually also need to pull together some tools. So some of those tools relate to, well, how do we formulate a quantitative conceptual site model? How do we think about remedy performance and optimization evaluation? So there's tools for how we do that. Predictive modeling is a tool, as well as data analytics. So we need to think about those types of approaches and how we use those, again, to build the information that goes into how we frame the problem, the guidance, and then how we support the decision makers. And then the last, of course, is related to the building blocks. Well, therefore, given that we have to provide certain type of information, how do we go out to the site and understand the site properties, hydrology, attenuation processes, the remediation process itself? So how do we support modeling and monitoring? So here's where there's a lot of decisions to be made, right? So we have to kind of set up our framework, because this is where we're spending money to go out and put in boreholes or collect samples and get some specific information that will feed this process. So this is all a part of this understanding what we need to know. And my proposal here is that, well, before we go out and do that, we need to kind of construct this entire chain here that I've got on this slide. And you might think of, you know, the decisions are driving what we're aiming at. The guidance and objectives really say, well, what do we need to justify making a decision? So we'll set that framework. Interpretation, we're really trying to provide some pedigree for what information we have and how we've interpreted it. How can we, you know, justify and have a pedigree for what we're explaining to the decision makers? And then of course the site information is our rigor. That's the amount of building blocks, the amount of information we have to support. So that's what I want to talk about. But again, it's all part of needs to be done together, because if we do any of these independently, then we kind of lose the integrated approach, and therefore we don't have as strong of a technical defensibility to provide to the decision makers. And that's really what we're after, and especially for complex sites. So that's sort of a setup to the issue here and how we might answer that question, and it gives an approach that we might want to consider. So now I want to just kind of walk through some examples and say, well, how would we implement this, and And what do we look for when we try and do this in this coordinated way that I'm talking about? So the first thing we'll talk about here is characterization. And again, so here you might think of what we need to know in terms of contaminant mobility and what are the controlling processes and how do we characterize the risk at a given site. And that relates to understanding, obviously, the field scale, what our plume looks like, for instance, and how it might be moving. And then we have to also understand, well, what's controlling that? What are the factors that we're going to need to understand in terms of the risk and why and how that plume might continue to move. So let's look at an example here. We'll look at the Hanford site here. I've selected because I do a lot of work at the Hanford site. And one of the things that we have here as a characteristic of the site is we have a portion that has a very thick vadosome. And so there have been releases to contamination into that vadosome, this upper part of the subsurface. And the real question we have here with this thick vadosome is we're concerned about this groundwater as risk for exposure. That's the exposure pathway that we have to help consider in terms of the risk for these contaminants. So in terms of our context, we have to think of these vadosome contaminants in terms of their potential as a source to groundwater. And a key element of that is, well, how do we think about what we have in the vadosome and the strength of it as a source to create or sustain or grow groundwater plumes. So that's kind of a context for an issue that we have at Hanford. So when we think about articulating that issue in terms of supporting decisions about selecting and implementing remedies, we need to think about, well, what are ways that we can help formulate that question? So what sort of guidance and objectives can we use? And so going out into the literature, looking at what sort of things are available, we need to maybe think about the vadosome in terms of the vadosome processes. So if you look at that figure on the left-hand side, we'll note that if waste is discharged here at the surface, it has to travel through the vadosome, and there are a number of different processes that will occur along that path. So functionally, what enters the vadosome at the top gets changed in some way in terms of how it results in a flux to groundwater at the bottom, and therefore what might result in how that creates or sustains a plume. So on the right-hand side, you might think of natural attenuation. There's this concept where we balance, well, what do we know about the source flux and our natural attenuation capacity? And depending on the relative strengths of those two basic processes, we can then determine whether or not we have an expanding, stable, or declining plume. If we think about that for a vadosome groundwater system, this first part of it, the source and the source flux, has to consider that there are all these processes that are occurring in the vadosome that relate ultimately to what that source flux is into the groundwater, where we might think about whether or not that plume will be expanding, stable, or diminishing based on the natural attenuation capacity. So those are things that we can glean from looking at how do we set about the context for making this decision, and that's really folds into this overall approach. So here, the decision we're pointing to is the need for mitigation and selecting a remedy, trying to get characterization information for that. The guidance that we can apply, since we think about our system as having some attenuation processes in the vadosome that relate to our source flux, we have to look at guidance for, well, how do we articulate those natural attenuation processes? And then there's also guidance out there that talks about how do we evaluate and quantify our source flux. So those are things that we can use to help us articulate the framework for what we need to know and how we're going to answer this question to support the decision. And what I'm going to talk about in terms of interpretation are, well, we need to fold that into a predictive modeling interpretation scheme. The reason is because we have if we have contamination in the vadosome, it's going to come out over time to create this plume. So we need to know, well, how do we predict that will unfold over time so we can then make the appropriate decision on action. So it's really a predictive question. And then the root information I'll talk about is, well, how do we now think about data we need to collect on attenuation processes that help us support this predictive modeling that will support our framework for making these ultimate decisions. So let's look at a couple of ways to do that. And And I wanted to bring out the fact that, well, again, we need to think about this as a process. It's not a, okay, we'll go and decide exactly what to do. We'll go collect a specific piece of data and then we're done. We may have to think about this also in terms of scoping the issue. And so we may enter this not at the information stage, but at the interpretation stage, where we set our scoping evaluation to allow us to refine our approach. So here, there's some work that we did to look at this idea of a waste disposal in terms of the discharge volume and the site characteristics and how that relates to the types of flux profiles you might expect in the groundwater. So if we have an initial discharge that is enough to drive contamination all the way to the groundwater, after that discharge is stopped, there'll be another scenario that develops. So during discharge, contaminated water is moving downward and connecting with the groundwater. It's actually also moving outward. It's dispersing laterally in the vadose. So later in time, we have this sort of broader contaminated zone that then comes down at a slower rate as driven by the recharge and drainage of the vadose. And we can get some different shapes to the flux curve that we'll have to think about. And so this gives us a way to think about interpreting what might be occurring in terms of a flux profile. But what we have to layer on top of this, the uncertainty, is related to what attenuation happened in that vadose along those pathways. So this is a flux discharge based on just water movement. Now we have to fold in the contaminant elements so that we can come up with some flux estimates. So let's look at how we then build upon that scoping analysis and say, well, now I've kind of defined the context for my interpretation and I know what sort of information I need to gather for supporting this need to know in terms of how I'll eventually support my decision. So that also is a graded approach. We might think of attenuation and saying, well, what portion of what went in the ground in terms of a contaminant mass is mobile in the sense that it's going to make it all the way to the groundwater. And so the example here is over on this right-hand side, I'm looking at a couple different things. So here's the uranium where we've applied a sequential extraction to a sediment sample that's been removed from the contaminated zone. So these are different sediment samples, and I'm going to focus on this one that had the largest amount of uranium in it. What we do is we take that sediment, we expose it to a fairly light extraction solution, just some groundwater, and then we expose it to sequentially harsher and harsher extraction solutions to try and pull more and more contamination out. And what you see is the amount of uranium that comes out is color-coded. So the red and orange came out with very light extraction fluids. So that would be characterized as fairly mobile contamination. The yellow and orange only come out if we apply very harsh extraction. So those are less and less mobile. If we compare this to how much uranium comes out in a leaching column, so if we pack that same sediment into a column and we run water through it and we measure how much uranium mass comes out over time before it essentially stops eluting, you can see that the amount that eluted from this column, which is this pink bar, is pretty similar to sort of the magnitude of this red and orange material. So now we've quantified that while we might have all of this mass might have been discharged at the surface, there's an amount of mass that's now been immobilized to some extent, such that it is not mobile in the sense that it will come out in a leaching experiment. So that's important to understand. And so that can help us identify, now how do I fold that over on top of my hydraulic analysis of flux in the vadose. So that's the way we can walk through this process of identifying what's mobile. We may think about now transport parameters. So I may do some leaching experiments to identify how I can fold that into a model. And then I might think about mechanisms. So the mechanisms for why this happened in terms of uranium versus iodine might be important to think about in terms of justification. And of course, technetium-99, there's not any of that sort of attenuation. It's all mobile, it's all red material. So these are ways that we have to think about collecting data, putting it into the interpretation scheme, and supporting the decision. What guides this? Well, what guided this was that the guidance documents, because there is where we define sort of the level of information that is appropriate to support these decisions. And that's in fact what did happen. So I'm showing this example data But this is what we applied at the Hanford site. We went out and we said, what does the natural attenuation guidance tell us? What does the source flux guidance tell us in terms of information we need to put on the table? We therefore went and collected information like I'm showing you. Up front, we talked with the decision makers so that they knew that this was the type of information that they would see, so we could all agree that yes, if we understand these elements, we will be able to make the decision that's at hand. So that's one example from characterization. I'll run through a couple here now for remediation. In remediation, again, we have to think about setting, what those controlling processes are, how we're going to have to work with our system. We have to think about what we're going to be doing in terms of our remediation process, whether it's going to be effective and whether it's going to be implementable. So we have to, there's some technical information we have to put on the table so we can support selecting a given remedy based on its effectiveness and implementability. And then once it's selected, we're going to have to think about monitoring and evaluation and optimization. So there are going to be some there's going to be some decisions related to implementing the remedy and making adjustments and eventually moving to closure that we're going to have to make. So those are kind of categories of things that we have to think about for remediation. So let's look at a couple of examples of how we've looked at this previously. So I'll use one where, again, well, I'll talk first now about remediation closure. So let's begin with the end in mind. And so soil vapor extraction is a method where we can put a well into the vadose zone. We can extract contaminated vapor, and that's a good way to get contamination out of the vadose zone for a volatile contaminant. But like with any extraction process, it has diminishing returns. And the reason for that is while the contaminant vapor moves readily in high permeability zones, there may be low permeability zones where we can't effectively move soil gas, and we can't effectively remove as much of the contamination. So there may be some remaining. Well, when we think about closure, if we know we're embarking on a process that will have diminishing returns, we have to say, well, how far down do we need to get this contamination so that it won't be a threat to the groundwater or to vapor intrusion? So that's a question because the risk is here at the surface and in the groundwater. So what can we leave here and not be a risk? And that is essentially a transport question, right? We need to know, well, if we leave a certain amount here, how much will transport to these zones of interest? And that's where we need to look at, well, how do we do that process? And so our decision here is for remedy closure, but we really need some guidance on how do we formulate that question that I talked about in the slide above? How do we put that in front of the decision makers and say, well, if this is really how we're going to have to manage this remedy because we know it'll have diminishing returns, how are we going to answer this question at the end? Well, there's some guidance out there that talks about that. And that guidance talks about predictive modeling, because we have to use this transport process to evaluate how much can we leave and not be a risk. And the type of information we're going to have to gather relates to parameters that support that modeling and the type of monitoring data that we have to support understanding the site. So the guidance, the purpose of the guidance was to outline on the left-hand side here a framework for how we can conceptualize the issue, how we can define how big our source is, where it's located, what its characteristics are, into a transport framework that we can use that people will agree that if we do this calculation, we can support a decision. Now, we may still need to validate that with verification monitoring, but if we can agree up front to this, that's the benefit of doing the upfront sort of discussion of what's in a guidance document. We also might have to agree on, well, how are we going to collect the information to have enough pedigree and confidence in our data that we are effectively parameterizing the model in an appropriate way. And so there's also guidance and tools out there that talk about, for instance, how do we look at profiles of vapor that are extracted from wells, and that vapor comes at different locations from different times, right? As we extract, we have a different radius of influence of where that vapor is coming from. And then the profile of this concentration versus time curve really relates to where are we contacting contaminated material. So there's very different profile for this sort of scenario than we might have for a scenario down here in the lower right-hand corner. So these are ways that if we line this out up front, then we kind of make sure that everyone understands the level of information that we'll have, how we're going to analyze it, and therefore how we're going to support a decision. And that's that process that I had on the previous slide. And then that gets folded into actually conducting the analysis. So this is an example of a tool that was developed that runs down that whole process. It talks about how the decision is going to be made. It talks about how the information is collected, and then ultimately provides a tool to do those calculations. And that is what can then be used to support decisions about soil vapor extraction, where we know up front we can't get every molecule out of the ground. So that's an example for a remediation. A couple other examples here. We might think about pump and treat. It's another example of remediation process that's successful for certain things and not successful for others. So pump and treat can be applied to mobile contaminants. So here's another example from the Hanford site. We have a mobile contaminant plume. This is an initial plume. This black zone up here in the upper left-hand corner is the Columbia River. And so because it's a mobile contaminant, pump and treat was applied, and as a matter of fact, it did diminish the plume very substantially. But again, pump and treat is something you manage along the way. In terms of thinking about pump and treat, you have to watch the performance. And if you have zones of persistent contamination, then you need to investigate those zones and determine, do I keep doing pump and treat because I think that will work, or are there other ways to supplement the remedy to address these zones that are looking like they are persisting? And that was the case here at the Hanford site with this chromate contamination. But the question was, well, if it's chromate, why isn't it mobile? Why isn't it just moving and being extracted by the pump and treat system? And what happened was we went back and we looked at natural attenuation literature and guidance and said, well, what sort of processes might be at play? We collected some samples, and here's just some electron micrograph sequence where you see the sediment particles and these different electron micrographs pointing down to where we used an electron microprobe, and we could see, well, these precipitates are actually calcium, chromate, carbon, and oxygen, suggesting that we have, and as is supported by the literature, a precipitated form of chromate that will now create a secondary source. And so we now looked at that as something that was formed in this area. We backed up into the source characteristics, understood that, and realized that pump and treat is not going to be a good way to address that because it's going to have a slow release from dissolution. And now the site is looking at soil flushing options. So that sort of story of what happened really started with this idea of having to make a decision about managing the pump and treat remedy. We looked at guidance for pump and treat exit strategies and evaluating source flux to help us frame the question for examining what was happening with the site where we saw this zone of persistence. And then we applied performance evaluation, and we really looked at some attenuation data to help us understand the nature of that source. So, but doing it in this way gave us a structure that we had everybody knowing what we were doing as we started. So when we first saw that this was an issue, we could talk through that whole process of how we're going to go about and investigate the issue to come to a decision. So the last piece I'll talk about is really sort of at the design stage of a decision. So we've talked a lot about, how do you select a remedy and how do you implement it? Well, in the middle of that, there's the design process. And there are some decisions we have to make in terms of either selecting the nuances of how we apply a remedy, or maybe how we're going to monitor its performance so we can have some confidence that it will indeed work. And so here's an example where we might want to use a particulate amendment and inject that into the ground. So this is just a screenshot of some particulate amendments in solution. We want to inject that into a zone, but we know that that's not going to be a perfect injection zone. It's going to go maybe further in certain preferential pathways and less in some higher and some lower permeability zones. And we need to know how that amendment is distributed because that's directly related to the performance of the remedy. And so when we think about how to apply that, we can still think about this approach of, well, how do I go about and answer that question to support the decision of whether or not this should be used as a remedy? And in this case, we said, well, is there a way that instead of using monitoring wells, where it's difficult to sort of image what this amendment distribution might look like, is there a way we can use geophysics? And so we did what we call an upfront synthetic evaluation of geophysics. So we looked at the guidance out there and tools that were out there, and we said, hey, we should be able to ascertain our ability to use geophysics up front. And the way we do that is we said, well, we can identify different sizes of targets. So if we say that we want to see this at a resolution of a 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot cube with geophysics and know if there's particles in that cube. Can we run a synthetic simulation and see if geophysics will actually be able to resolve that? And so in this result, that's what this first result is. And it says, okay, from this green background, I see an anomaly, a yellow zone that's associated with particles in that zone based on their change in electrical properties. If I put more conductive particles in there, or I put a bigger zone in, I can see a bigger highlight. So we can use this upfront process to identify our ability to monitor a remedy, which is directly related to its design and its implementation. So here, again, upfront in that process of designing the remedy, we need to articulate across, if we're going to manage and optimize this remedy and support those decisions, let's look and see, well, how can we identify methods such as geophysics and evaluate them, what guidance is out there, and then how can we interpret that through the predictive modeling, in this case, synthetic modeling that helps us understand the potential for the geophysical response for our given situation. And then how is that going to relate to both synthetically how I collect that data and do that analysis, but what will it relate to how I'm going to see data in the future in the field. So again, we can still apply this sort of approach, and the idea is, let's talk about that up front. So again, we have a process in mind, so we better articulate to the people who are going to decide, yes, we want to use geophysics, or no, we don't want to. Yes, we want to use this remediation approach, or no, we don't want to. What do we put on the table to help that decision? I'm just going to close here briefly and just note that, you know, I really think that this is something to think about in the type of work that we do in terms of applying technical guidance and thinking about our objectives and interpretation-driven approaches. RemPlex is really sort of formulated around that. It's really designed to foster collaborative efforts where we can, through our collaboration, think about developing and making available appropriate technical guidance documents, either ones that are already produced or thinking about, well, what other ones are useful as to the remediation community? How can we think about tools that are helpful to us? How can we think about what sort of laboratory or field of investigation capabilities are going to be helpful? And how can we advance this as a collaborative effort as a community, so that when we get to our site-specific condition, where we have to understand that to support a site-specific decision, we have these processes, capabilities, and tools available to us, because that really does facilitate our work, especially at complex sites. So in summary, I think I've hopefully provided you an idea of this sort of approach, how we might be able to use this to our advantage. Kind of talked about this idea of need to know and how we can articulate that in a way that really relies on sort of an upfront framework for that process, and really ties together all of the elements, information, interpretation, objectives, and guidance, so that that collectively feeds into decisions. So with that, I'll close out and thank everybody for attending. I will note that, again, this is done as part of the RemPlex Center. I did provide some references at the end, so if you want to look those up as afterwards, this will be available for download. But with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that we have.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Great presentation. We have over 50 folks online today, so we have a few questions. I see some coming through the chat now. So I guess one question I want to start off with was, on your slide that you had for complex site approach elements, decisions, guidance and objectives, interpretations, and information, you went through that slide a couple of times for a couple examples. Can you talk a little bit about who's responsible for contributing to each step, whether it's the site, whether it's a regulatory agency, whether it's an entity like PNNL, other collaborators, and specifically, where does PNNL have a role?
Well, I guess I'll kind of answer that question a little bit more broadly. So, you know, as I talked about up front, the decision box on the left-hand side is really going to be a series of decision makers, right? And so there's going to be multiple parties involved. And I guess what I was really talking to was the fact that those decision makers will have a number of different factors they'll have to evaluate, but there's a role for the technical folks. So that would be either the site contractor, the environmental consultants, or entities like national laboratories, where we are responsible as a member of the team to bring forward actionable technical information so the decision makers can say, okay, we now understand enough about the site and the characteristics of our different decision options for the decision that we can now select the right decision. So really the role is, there's decision makers that say, here's what we have to understand. The guidance documents are things that we as both the regulatory community and the technical consultants and the national labs need to actually collectively develop, because this is defining what we think we need to know. And that's really something that is both a question for the regulators and technical people. That's, for instance, why the ITRC is so powerful, because it brings all those people together. So it's a great teaming sort of relationship. As we get down to the right-hand side of this box, we might have more of the detailed technical folks involved in terms of modelers and folks that work with interpretation and people that go out and collect data. But really, that has to be integrated across the whole process, because that information has to be compiled and synthesized so that everyone can understand it and work on it in an actionable way over here on the left side. So it really is an integrated approach. And I think there's really a role across the board. And the key part of this idea is that really we need to know that up front, so everybody knows what we're doing and why we're doing it, so we don't get to the decision point and say, well, we don't know yet. We want to know up front that we're going down the right approach to get the actionable information on the table.
Excellent, thank you. So speaking of ITRC, you mentioned ITRC. We have a question in the chat from Jennifer Nyman. She's asking, the ITRC guidance document talks about periodically revisiting objectives, interim and final. In your experience, is that useful, and how often should objectives be revisited?
Yeah, well, I think there's two aspects to that. So I think certainly for the interim objective. So just as a bit of background, so a site objective is your ultimate goal for a site. So it's when we're done with this cleanup, what do we want to be the quality of the groundwater, the quality of the soil, the characteristics of the site. The interim objectives really are objectives that along the way, we want to say, as we implement remediation, we want to reach certain milestones, have certain metrics. And those are things that we do need to watch constantly, because we don't know everything at the start of remediation. So as you impose your remediation solution, remediation is one of the best characterizations you'll ever do, right? You learn things as you go, and therefore you need to reassess and say, well, we thought we were going to reach this metric. We didn't quite reach it because now we know better. And so now let's reassess that objective and reset it. So I think that feedback loop is what adaptive management is all about. Now, there also may be situations where ultimately, as you learn from that process, you may look at your ultimate site objectives and decide there are going to be some limitations, and that may be open for discussion, but those are sort of much bigger objectives and need a broader discussion to change. But that's where there are processes in place like ARAR waivers where that might be appropriate. And in fact, that is one example of how those are applied. A technical impracticability waiver may be applied, which essentially changes some of those ultimate site objectives by having an ARAR waiver, because it was shown that remediation is not practicable from an engineering perspective. So I think to answer the question, I think both of those do need to be looked at all the time during the process, and there needs to be an ongoing reflection on decisions and determination as to whether or not there need to be changes in objectives.
Great, thank
you.
And
I think that's consistent with the ITRC Remediation of Management of Complex Sites document.
Excellent. Are there other, what other entities or groups puts out guidance documents other than ITRC?
Well, there are a number. I mean, I view a lot of the recent EPA materials as being really great examples. I pointed to the natural attenuation guidance, which I think was a really seminal publication. I think the recent EPA publications have been really good in those ways. I think if you look on the EPA's Clue-In site, there's a whole range of what I would classify as guidance documents or technical tool guidance information. And so those come out from a variety of institutions, including, for instance, PNNL, so national labs and other national labs have produced technical documents that explain and promote ways to organize technical efforts. So that in a sense is a guidance document. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, also puts out guidance documents. So there are a lot of people that do this, and I think the reason is because they are important, because there is a recognition in how they need to be used. What I'm trying to promote is that we do, in everything we do, we at least look and say, hey, is there a way that we need to do this that best fits into how guidance has been developed, so it helps the decision process? Because people have thought about these decisions before, and they have expectations. And so there are a number of entities that have put out some good guidance that help us at a specific site say, okay, if those are the expectations, let's figure out how to best meet those so our decisions will be facilitated.
Gotcha. Okay. And we've talked a lot about guidance. You talked a little bit about the soil vapor extraction tool. What other tools are available to support the process that you talked about?
Well, there's a myriad of tools. I think even starting with the myriad of predictive modeling tools, but there's also tools for different levels of predictive modeling. So there's, of course, the numerical modeling tools, but there have been a lot of really good tools that have come out in terms of mass balance tools, analytical solutions for transport. I think about things like BioChlor and RemChlor sorts of tools, where they were really generated out of this need to support whether or not a plume is expanding, stable, or diminishing, whereby you're calculating things in a way that's supportable, but can be done at a level without conducting a full numerical solution. So there's a range of tools. I think in a lot of the ITRC documents, there's good resources to find those tools. At the Cluen website, there's lots of resources. And I think one of the goals of RemPlex is to try and pull together some of the tools that may be useful. And so, from PNNL's toolbox, some of the things that I mentioned, we've worked on the E4D, which is the geophysics data inversion tool that I mentioned. We've worked on the SVE end state tool. We worked on a pump and treat exit strategy document. So there's a lot of entities that produce these, and there are a lot of them out there. Our goal is, well, we got to go out and sift and find the ones that are most appropriate. That's also I think one thing that Cluen does very well, and I think it's also something that RemPlex really has a goal to do, to try and help structure available tools and relate those to the challenges at hand.
Great, excellent, thank you. We have two questions that came in the chat from Chris Halter. First, he's asking, have you thought about using SIP or ERT to monitor the amendment movement in the contaminant plume?
The answer is definitely yes. Tim Johnson, who's here at PNNL, has really done some great work along with the other folks in the industry that have worked with ERT and SIP, and really advanced our ability to use that in terms of tracking amendments, because of some of the things I showed in that last example, the ability to do some synthetic upfront design to evaluate the resolution of geophysics. So ERT is something that works on looking at the bulk conductivity of the ground. And when you inject something like an amendment that changes that bulk conductivity in the zone where the amendment is present, then you can use things like ERT to track that in real time. And so, yes, we have been doing that. We've done that for several projects. SIP is sort of an added advancement to that, where we can now look at the characteristics of the current flow in the ground that helps you understand whether or not there have been processes that have changed the characteristics of the surface of the sediment particles. And a lot of times those changes in sediment surface properties are related to remediation processes. So there's a way that we're looking now at trying to correlate using geophysics data to help us understand, are the right remediation processes happening based on the changes that we're observing? So that's a great question. And yes, it is a topic of really significant research these days. So yes.
Great, thanks, Mike. We have time for one more question. And so there's a question from Mason Murphy. It's about monitored natural attenuation. Mason says that monitored natural attenuation is often prescribed for contaminants like strontium-90. However, ecological understanding and genetic fitness is still poorly understood. With more genetic information on aquatic organisms, would you expect natural attenuation to be phased out for previously accepted contaminants as new information is presented on the ecological consequences of M&A for those contaminants?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it is accommodated in the regulations and in remediation processes to look at those sorts of changes. So that's why, for instance, we have strictly 5-year reviews to make sure that, for instance, there's still protectiveness. Now, the types of change you're talking about would have to be something that would then be implemented as a change to the fundamental receptor protectiveness, a change in the standard. That would then relate to a change in an objective that would then have to be reflected upon in terms of the protectiveness of the remedy. If it was determined that was not protective because of that change, that may be something that would have to be considered. So the regulations do account for that. I think one of the, that's really a regulatory sort of question in terms of, making that sort of change to a requirement. I think the process that I talked about would have to be then employed to then go back and relook at the plume situation and reevaluate whether or not M&A would be able to meet that changed requirement or not. So I think it's a good question. I think it's allowable, but really it's driven by whether or not the regulators do change that yardstick, so to speak, because there is new information. And so, an example of that might be, arsenic, right? It changed from 50 ppb to 10 ppb. Well, the industry had to react to that. And so it does happen. And so it's certainly something that would have to be considered.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining our seminar today. And just a reminder that the seminar will be archived on the RemPlex website. We look forward to presenting our next seminar on evaluation approaches for transitioning from active to passive remediation. That'll be on September 23rd, so keep an eye out on your email for the seminar announcement. More information on the September seminar is available on the RemPlex website. And if you don't already receive the RemPlex newsletter, feel free to shoot us an email at remplex@pnnl.gov, and we will get you signed up for the newsletter. So thank you again. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for all of the questions. Bye.